All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us live. If you're here with us live, leave a message in the chat box and say hi so I know that you're here. Today, I am here with Chantel Bongiovanni. I said that
Hi.
right?
You did. You
Okay.
did. Great.
Um, and we are here talking about uh, disability and writing disabled characters. So I'll let Chantel go ahead and introduce herself and tell a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Hi. So, my name is Chantel Bongiovanni. I am a person with disability from Australia. I live in Adelaide. I am involved in some writing. So I've been published in some anthologies about disability, and I'm also undertaking a PhD in the area of disability. And I'm also a power chair athlete. So disability is kind of not only like a lived experience, but it's also just a part of my life that I'm involved with lots of different disability communities. And yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Um, so we have one person in the chat right now saying hi. Hi, Kim. Thanks
Hi.
for joining us. Um, so for those of you who may be new to my channel, this is a series that I do monthly that I started called Writing Diversely. And I do these interviews once a month, interviewing people from different diverse backgrounds and talking about what writers should know when creating a character from that background. So before we begin the interview, um, I want to start off by saying, and I say this every time I do an interview with everyone, but I want to remind you guys that remember, people are all individuals. And so everyone's journey and experience are going to be different. It's going to look different for everyone. And so Chantel is going to share with us her experiences, and I'm hoping it'll be very helpful for you guys in your writing. But keep in mind that she does not speak for every single disabled person out there. So just want to throw that out there and remind everyone of that. So yeah, let's get started. Um, so my first question, uh, let me go ahead and pull them up, is what is your disability?
So I have SMA, or spinal muscular atrophy. So it's a neuromuscular condition. And basically, I'm a wheelchair user. I walked when I was young, and I progressively sort of lost the ability to walk, and now I'm a full-time wheelchair user. SMA affects all voluntary muscles. So muscles are just weaker than what they should be.
Right. And how old were you when you were diagnosed?
Probably about a year and a half, I believe. That was kind of around when symptoms started to appear. So yeah.
Okay. And how long were you able to continue walking before it got more difficult?
I was about 8 when I stopped walking sort of independently, and then I was still standing and things like that till I was about 19. So at about 19, I stopped doing any kind of weight bearing.
Okay. And this is exactly what I mean, you guys, when I say everyone is different, everyone's experience is different. Chantel has SMA. I also have SMA as well, spinal muscular atrophy. And if you guys have seen my previous playlist of interviews, you know I did one a couple months ago with Madison, who also has SMA. And so all of our experiences are different. So, Chantel, you were able to have a bit more of your mobility and stuff into later on. Um, I had, I was diagnosed at 2.5 years old, and I never once walked. I stood a little bit as a baby, but not much since childhood. So I've always used a wheelchair pretty much my whole life. And so you can kind of see how, you know, even within the same disability, experiences ranges for how
Yeah.
that looks like.
Yeah, it's very much a very all disability is an individualized experience. You know, like we might have common experiences in some ways, but you know, we are at the end of the day, we are all our own individuals, and I think that's yeah, like what you're saying. It's important to remember that.
Yeah. Um, so my next question was, when you were diagnosed with your disability, what was that like for you? How did you feel about it? And
I think my experience was one where I just didn't know any different. I think that that's something that probably, I mean, in terms of writing, probably is maybe what people don't always realize is that if you are born with a disability, you probably just don't know any different, and you're just living life, and that's very much how I was. I don't know what it's like not to have a disability. It's just a part of who I am. So it just feels as natural to me as living and breathing, and that's just um, I never really grappled with it too much because that's just how it is.
yeah. Um, and so, uh, also going along with, we're talking about disability and using these terms and stuff. So I wanted to get your take on some vocab terms, because some people prefer person first language and some prefer identity first. So, do you prefer the term person with the disability or disabled person? How do you view those?
Look, I think that it's a really interesting topic because I feel like there are either side of the spectrum that people go on. Personally, for me, I'm actually okay with both of those terms depending on how they're used. Um, I prefer to use disabled person a lot of the time when I'm just talking casually. But I will sometimes use person with disability if I'm in a more formal setting or something like that. Um, Personally, I know that there is a politics that relates to each one, but I feel like as a disabled person, um, I'm my choice is kind of my choice because that's my experience. And yeah, for me, I'm okay with both. It just depends on how you're using them and in what context that you're using them in.
Right. Right. And so, um, and so I always lose my train of thoughts.
So
I've uh, found out recently that that is an ADHD thing, which I did not know. But until recently, I'm like, oh, so that's why I'm always like in the middle of a thought and then I don't know what I'm gonna say. So, yeah. So my next question was, what ways? So growing up with the disability, in what ways do you think you were treated differently because of your disability, and how did it make you feel?
So I definitely think just with the earlier question about how I felt about my disabilities, like yeah, I always that was just always my experience. Like I just have a disability. That's just how it is, and I never really thought much about it until I actually had reactions from other people about my disability. So I guess once I started going to school and I was around people that maybe hadn't been around disabled people much before or other kids, that was when I really started to notice that there was this different way of treating people with a disability. And I think definitely there's always been those angles of there is the pity aspect. Like I would always get maybe older people who would feel really sorry for me, who would want to come up and ask questions or assume that my life was not very good or something like that, making those really big assumptions without having any idea about me at all. um, and then as well, I guess there's also just the all of that systemic stuff with people with disability being able to access their environment, being able to be included, being able to access things, get access to services, all of that sort of stuff. I mean, for me, it's they were the things that really came up as big issues. It was never my disability, but it was me going out into the world with a disability, was where I really noticed that there was something different going on. In terms of how it made me feel, I think it's been a long journey. Like I think that it's hard to summarize quickly, but it's a journey of like first that, oh, okay, there's something different. How do I react to that? What kind of strategies can I do to manage that? And then as well, it's just having to navigate that all the time can be tiring. Like always having to advocate for just basic services, or educate people who come up to you and say something that is perhaps not really very nice, or making assumptions. There's a lot of labor that goes on for disabled people in having to navigate all of those kind of levels of society. So I think for me, sometimes I just get tired. I think that's how I can answer that.
Yeah. So speaking of kind of, going out into the world and having to navigate, you know, um, things with having the disability, uh, I kind of wanted to ask, since you are in Australia, you're not in the US, so I'm sure things are different. How are, I mean, I guess, how are things in Australia, um, in terms of, I guess, just how accessible, or
Like
how,
services,
huh?
like services.
Yeah, services, and just in general, how are the accessibility, I guess,
Yeah.
because I don't know, in well, obviously I'm in the US and I haven't been to Australia, but I know my parents went on a trip to Australia one time, and they, which is what also made me really want to go visit, was they were telling me how much more accessible things were over there in terms of finding transportation, accessible transportation, um, and hotels and things like that. So I was just
Yeah.
wondering.
So, I mean, look, I think every country that you're in always will have some things that are not completely accessible, or they're still working on it. I think, in terms of Australia, I would say the accessibility is pretty good. So, I mean, in Adelaide, where I live, the trains are all accessible. They're phasing out buses that are inaccessible. So, like, if I were to go out, I would be able to take a train, and have the driver will bring out a ramp, and you can get on the train or you can get on the bus in a similar way. They will assist you on and off. So I mean, it's pretty okay. Like I do think there are always places that are inaccessible. Like there will be buildings with steps and stuff, but for the most part, it's not too bad. And I think there is. I have been able to feel, especially so in Australia, we've had this new disability services scheme called the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And that's basically a new system for accessing services for people with disability. And I've noticed since that's come about in the last 4 or 5 years that there's been a big jump in terms of accessibility, and in terms of just this push, I guess, to have more infrastructure in place, like more accessible housing, you know, making sure the public spaces are more accessible. And I think there's still work to do, but I think that Australia are trying their best to do better than what they were in the past. So that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, that's good. Um, um, so we talked about what what ways you might have been treated differently.
Mm.
But what ways growing up do you think your childhood was very much the same as other kids without disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it really came down to, I guess, my parents, because I have a brother with SMA as well. So I guess they had two children that were, quote unquote, almost the same, in terms of physical movement and things like that. Um, even he and I are a little bit different anyway. Just like we were saying earlier, that every experience is individual. But I think because of that, I think my parents kind of tried their best just to kind of be like, oh, well, you're just doing whatever the other kids are doing. We're not going to really make too many concessions. Like, obviously, you can have the things that you need in order to be able to do things. But I think they really did encourage us just to kind of get out there and do as much as we could. I think, I used to play with a lot of the kids in my street and things like that on the weekends. I guess I was doing it from a wheelchair, but once I kind of got to know the kids in the street, I'd maybe sometimes go and hang out with them, or I go to their houses, or they'd come to my house. And I think in that kind of respect, that there was a little bit of that social, that social stuff that was kind of the same. And I guess as well, like, all kids go through, especially when you're going through adolescence, all kids go through that identity crisis, like, who am I? How do I fit in the world?
Yeah.
And I think I had that experience just like every other kid. Um, yeah, I think that hopefully that answers your question a bit.
Yeah. Um, when it when it comes to interacting with other kids and playing and all that stuff, um, how do you uh, approach if I guess how do you handle it when kids want to ask why are you in a wheelchair or
Mm.
why?
I think that's changed over time. Like, I think when I was a kid, I didn't really know how to answer a question like that. Um, I think I would just say, oh, I don't walk, or I'd get a bit. I didn't really know what to say. Um, And I think maybe I wouldn't have wanted to talk about it as easily as I do now. Whereas I think as an adult now, if a kid were to approach me and ask a question like that, I never begrudge people a question like that, especially if they're a younger child, because I think they're just trying to learn and they may not have met someone with a disability before. Um, I think for me, if I'm going to answer that question, I usually just say, "Oh, I just, this is just my body. This is just how it works." That's normally how I would answer it now. Whereas I think in the past, I would have wanted to go into more of a like a medicalized kind of explanation. I've got this thing, and this is what it does, and this is what happens to me. Whereas I think now when I approach children, yeah, I just say, "Oh, like, this is just how my body is. I just don't walk. This is just how it is. Your body does things that are different too. We're just different people." Like, I just try not to make it too different. I just say, this is just how it is, because that is just how it is. Everybody has different experiences.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so my next question, speaking of different experiences, is were you ever involved in any treatment or therapy for your disability? And if so, what was the process like?
So for me, like, I've only really ever accessed physio. Um, I mean, I think that's really just more about maintenance of, with the disability changing, it's really just about maintenance. But there are treatments, as you would know, there are treatments now available for SMA. There's Spinraza and Evrysdi. Currently, they're not available for people over 18 in Australia, so I'm not able to access treatment. So I think that I've actually been quite involved in some of the advocacy around that. At least I try to be as much as I can, because obviously in Australia, it's a huge unmet need in the adult population that we don't have access to a treatment option unless you're incredibly wealthy. but even then it's not really sustainable. So yeah, it's kind of an ongoing issue in the adult community for SMA in Australia. So yeah, for me, I'm just, doing my best to advocate, and hopefully eventually there will be some treatment options available.
Yeah. Wow, I didn't. That's good to know. Interesting, because I didn't know that it wasn't available for adults.
No.
Over
Yeah, it varies country to country. Like, I knew that it was quite widely available in the US. So basically in Australia, if you're under 18, you are able to access Evrysdi or Spinraza. Um, but they have not funded it to the adult population. And I, like, personally, I think that is very much, um, I think it's very much related to money, and how much money can we put forward. And I think it's also a question of, uh, I think that the data is growing around it all the time, and I think eventually it'll come through. But I think that it is definitely a question about money. Um, and
yeah.
the last rejection from the medical associations here kind of basically indicated that there was a cost that they weren't sure if it was worth funding for the adult population. That was essentially the report. So I think it's an ongoing issue, and I think it really does come down to the way that you value people with disability and life. And I think it's just an ongoing advocacy issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um. So, uh, in your day-to-day tasks, do you have a caregiver that helps you with certain tasks?
Yeah.
And can you share what that's like?
Yeah. So I have sort of support workers throughout the day that are paid for through my funding. So my disability funding. So I have people coming sort of about 3 times a day. They help with everything from bathroom things to showering, getting up and dressed for the day. Um, it's mostly any time where I need to be moving from my wheelchair to something else, or anything like that, that I'll usually get a hand with. Sometimes I go to a weekly hydrotherapy session. I might have a support worker come with me there. It's really just, if those everyday things, that I just, yeah, it's nice to have someone around to help. So
Mhm. And you just remind me of another question. Um, Going back to again, terms and vocab. So, what is support worker? The typical terms
yeah.
you use? Okay.
Yes, I think you guys say, is it PCAs in the
Yeah,
US?
there's different ones depending on everyone. I've heard people say PCA for personal care attendant. Um, caregivers. I just say caregiver. It's easy.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
everyone has their own terms that they
Yeah, yeah,
use.
yeah. It's very interesting, actually, because I just said support worker without even thinking about it too much. But in Australia, a support worker will be someone who's a paid support person, or a paid sort of person giving care. And there is just a bit of a distinction. So if you were to say in Australia, if you were to say carer or caregiver, you would assume that's a family member, or that's someone who's not being paid, who's maybe doing it in a voluntary sort of capacity.
Oh,
Whereas a support worker is kind of like that's their job, sort of thing. So
okay.
so I do live with my parents, and they do give a little bit of they do give a little bit of my care, but the majority comes from paid support workers. So
Okay.
yeah.
So there's a distinction there. That
Yeah,
makes sense.
it's actually interesting. So I think Australia's made a. I remember it coming out, yeah, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, that it was a distinction that was made just so that, if you were going to be going for a job working for someone with a disability, that it was very clear that that's your job, and this is what your job title is, just to kind of make it really clear that there's a distinction. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, quite interesting how the language changes
Yeah,
country to country. Yeah,
but it makes sense. So that's good
yeah,
to know.
yeah.
Um, so I I had saw on your website. I visited your website. and I saw that you are an athlete and you play power chair hockey and power chair football. Um,
Yes.
so my question was, what I guess what is it like to uh, play a sport when you have a disability?
Yeah, so I was not a sporty child. Like I've always been very bookish and I've never really I think as well because I wasn't able to run around and things when I was younger. Um I didn't really take much interest in what sport was because I didn't really know that there were I knew that there were disability sports around, but I didn't really understand what they were and I never really had an opportunity to really try them. So I never took much interest. And then yeah, when I was about 18 or 19, I went to a sport competition and I watched my brother was actually playing in that competition because he was more sporty than I was. And yeah, I went there and I really actually really liked what I was watching, and I really liked the community that was around the disability sporting community that was there, and um, I think for me, I grew to kind of be interested in sport through that. It wasn't something that was just something that I always wanted to do; it just kind of happened. And I think for me, what it's like is that it's not just playing the sport. Like I think it's about that community that you're playing with. It's about your teammates. It's about the people that you meet. Um, and I think for me, it's not just when I'm playing on the court. It's also those leadership skills that I get from teaching other people how to play or from working with my teammates. And I think that those kind of things can actually be missing sometimes when you have a disability because you don't, if you're going to a school where, say, if you're a young person, you're going to a school where you don't ever meet other people with disability and you're not really participating in the physical education and stuff, you never actually get those kinds of experiences. You never get to learn those kind of playing side by side with teammates. You never get to learn those sort of things. So I learnt those things as an adult, and I kind of wish that they'd been a little bit more out there when I was younger that I could have accessed. Because I think that sport can be really great for people with disabilities. So
Yeah. Um, Now, when you are playing
mm.
the sport, is there are there special or different types of equipment that you have to use?
Yeah, so I play power chair football and power chair hockey. So power chair hockey is sort of like indoor soccer but played with an electric wheelchair, and that has a specialized high performance sort of sport chair that's used for that as well as like a large bull bar. So you use the bull bar to hit the ball and that sort of thing. I mean, yeah, if anyone's watching and you want to have a look, like you can Google power chair football and you can kind of see what I mean. You can kind of there's a lot of stuff on the internet with that, as well as power chair hockey is kind of very much the same. It's just a different wheelchair, but it is power chair hockey is sort of modeled off of something like ice hockey. So it has like a rink on the court, and then you have players can either use a hockey stick in their hands or they have a stick that's attached to the bottom of their chair if they don't have upper body movement. And then they would use either of those things to hit the ball around and stuff like that. So, and both of them have, specialized wheelchairs that you would use for the sport. Um,
Okay. And
yeah.
when you say uh, power chair football, remind me because I feel like I think it's only in America that we have different terms for this
Oh,
sport.
there's power. So yeah, America uses power soccer.
Okay, so you're talking about soccer.
Yes,
What
soccer.
we would
Sorry.
call
Yeah,
soccer.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
it is. It's yeah. So it's basically
yeah.
indoor soccer. So power chair football
Okay,
is like indoor soccer. And I think in the US, it's not as often called power chair football as it is power soccer.
yeah. Well, the U.S. is weird because we call football soccer, which the rest of the world calls it football, and it makes more sense because you're playing with your foot.
Well,
But
we do use soccer here because in Australia we also have this thing called Australian rules football, like Australian football. So, and that doesn't make much sense for the like soccer football. It is very confusing. I think sport names are very confusing because
Yeah.
it's like people was like, oh, it's foot and the ball, so let's just call it football. And then there's like 5 different footballs now. So what do we do?
Yeah. I see.
Yeah.
Um, so my next question was, so do you play as just a hobby or do you compete at like a professional level?
So I do play locally with a local club in both sports, but I do compete on a state level. So I do when COVID isn't happening. I usually do travel throughout the year for competitions. I have also played on a international level. I played hockey in the Power Chair Hockey World Championships back in 2018 in Italy. So yeah, so I've kind of played all levels. So yeah.
Nice. So I guess has uh what has been your favorite place to travel to while playing?
Oh, I mean, I think Italy was probably one of the best experiences. It was just, I mean, I think being at a world championship, it was kind of just felt, it was just a wonderful experience to meet so many different people from, different countries and to be, I guess, representing your own country in that. Yeah, I think Italy for me, that was probably one of the best places, one of the best experiences I've had with sport. So,
Cool. Um, and how do other people who are not disabled, how do they typically react when they hear that you're an athlete?
I mean, I definitely think that when people hear about disability sports, I think that they have this automatic perception of wheelchair basketball. And I think the amount of times, like I joke about it a bit, if I had $1 for every time I've been asked, if I want to play a game of wheelchair basketball and I'm clearly in a powered wheelchair, I cannot lift my arms, I cannot lift a ball, and someone's saying, "Oh, you want to shoot some hoops?" I'm like, no. Um, I think that there is this definite perception that there isn't a lot of knowledge around the different kinds of sports that are around for people with a disability to play. And I think that quite often, I, I would hope that that perception is changing, but I do believe that people aren't used to seeing disabled people as athletes. So I think there is always a little bit of like, oh, wow, like, didn't know that that was something that you would be doing. I didn't know that that was a thing. Um, so I definitely think that there is just, probably just a lack of awareness. It's not so much that people want to react that way, but they're just probably not aware. Um,
Yeah. Which is why, I like doing this series and talking about these things because I think representation is so important. And so, you don't know you know, unless
yeah,
that's your experience. And so that's why I like talking about it and hopefully helping writers to be able to, represent different characters well.
yeah, definitely.
Um, so kind of switching topics a little bit, but I know other than sports, another passion of yours is writing. Um,
Hmm.
and you've written some blog posts and stories about disability. And I guess my question is what makes you, other than the obvious fact that you have a disability, what makes you so passionate about writing about disability?
Um, I think that um, obviously there is my lived experience to draw upon. And I think that is a passion because um, you know, disability doesn't get talked about nearly enough in books and in media and in film and television. And I think that that became a passion because I had that lived experience of, perhaps growing up and not seeing a lot of disabled characters around. I think for me and my own writing, it's also that um, I feel like I do have a lived experience to draw upon, and I think that it makes sense not to shy away from that experience, but to use it to it's not just about bringing awareness, but it's also about bringing like an authenticity to the experience of disability. And I think that that's a real passion of mine, is just, because not like we've been saying, like every experience is different, but they're just, opening up that possibility for discussion, um for reflection, I think can be a really good thing. And people always want to learn, so I think it's writing about disability just makes sense to me.
Yeah, cool. Um, so other than writing and sports, um, is, are there any other things that you're passionate about, or any other hobbies that you have?
um like, I think that you know, a lot of things in my life do kind of come back to disability, because that is a passion. So I mean, sport is kind of one part, and writing about disability is another part. But I guess in my day to day, I guess it's I'm kind of working and I'm studying, and um, I don't know. I like crafts, but I mean, I'm kind of just like an old lady, even though I'm like 30. But I don't know. Like I think for me, like the big things that I do with writing and sport is my real day to day passions. So yeah.
Cool. Um, and then let's see. So, um, gonna leave off. Okay. So we know that people with disabilities oftentimes will face discrimination, especially in workplace, office employment situations. So, were there ever any times in your life that you felt like you were discriminated against because of your disability? And if so, how did you handle that?
So I definitely think that there has been a lot of times where the system itself has not been in favor of people with disability, and I've probably been caught up in that. I think that, unfortunately, like, I mean, I think, unfortunately, because of the fact that we are still all over the world, like, accessibility is not guaranteed. Access to services are not guaranteed. You will always face those kind of issues of discrimination, even if they're not putting it in those exact words. You will always kind of face those barriers that mean that you can't always participate in the way that you want to. Um, I think for me, like, I find, um, I think if I'm thinking of specific examples, I do think that there is definitely just, that day to day stuff of not having an accessible place to do things or be able to go, but also just the system of, I think, daily life in terms of careers and study and everything is such a machine, and there's such a big push on productivity and having to, we have to, as humans, it seems to be this perception in society that we're always having to produce and do more and push as far as we can go. And that reality for a lot of people with disability, like myself included, is that is really hard to come up against. And I think that even just the average person without a disability would often feel that machine kind of pushing at you to kind of do more and be more. And you've worked 5 days a week, why not 6? Like, just, and that kind of push. And I do think that it can have a really detrimental effect on people with disability. For me, how I handle it is I just do my best to navigate it as best as I can. I don't really know. I don't think I have all of the answers to it. I just think that it's something that comes up against every person with disability. And I think it's just unfortunately, we all have to kind of become our own, like, have to become advocates sometimes and sort of say what needs to be done. But even then, sometimes it can't always be fixed, and sometimes you have to make a decision to, you know, focus on the areas that are more you are more able to do if you don't have that energy or that force to be able to do that labor involved to make change, because change is not just made by one person, it's a collective, and sometimes it's hard to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Um, uh, See, you said something that reminded me of something,
That's
and now what was it?
okay. That's all right.
Uh, it'll come back to me
That's okay. When it comes
eventually.
back, yeah.
um, so another, my other question was, this seems to be something, a topic that has mixed views and feelings within the disabled community. And the topic is inspiration porn.
Oh, yeah.
So, um, how do you uh, how do you feel about being seen as an inspiration simply for living your life with a disability?
Yeah. So I I think I find inspiration porn difficult. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of it. And I think the reason that I don't like it is it's not so much it's got nothing to do with the individual and celebrating an individual's achievements. Like, that is a whole separate thing to the issue of inspiration porn. My thing with inspiration porn is that it actually detracts from the individual, because you're imposing quite often when I see a lot of those memes, like the only disability in life is a bad attitude, and then you have like a disabled person doing something, like what you're doing is like you're reducing that person's experience, and you're imposing like your own view, like you're like a bigger, like a societal view about disability is being imposed on that person. um and I think it's just it's not a factual experience of that person at all. There's actually a really well-known disability advocate in Australia. She's passed away now, unfortunately, but she was known as Stella Young. I'm not sure if you've heard of her, but she has a famous TED talk
Mm-hmm.
online. But basically, she sort of made this point that, like, when you have this statement like there's no disability, there's no such thing as the only disability in life is a bad attitude. She was like, well, I don't know that I've ever had stairs become a ramp simply by being really positive and like smiling at it, and it magically becomes a ramp and I can use it. Like, that's never happened. So there don't, like, when you're sort of what this inspiration porn does is that it takes away from real barriers and real issues for people with disability. And that's kind of why I don't particularly like inspiration porn, because it detracts from the real conversations that need to happen for people with disability to be living better lives and more meaningful lives. Um, so yeah, I think in terms of how I feel, I just think that it's not they like inspiration porn is not helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have someone in the chat who agrees, and Kim says nothing worse than inspiration porn.
I 100%
So,
agree.
um, and actually, we should probably kind of go back a little bit and explain what inspiration porn is for those who may watch this later on and say, "What the heck are they talking about?" Um, so, inspiration porn was a term coined by Stella Young, right? And I did see her TED Talk.
Yeah. I
Which
actually didn't even think about the fact that she did actually coin that term. And it's like, yeah, sorry, I just brought her up without even thinking about she did coin that term. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love her TED Talk, which I will leave a link in the description below to that TED Talk for anyone who wants to watch it. But basically, it's kind of like what we were saying, being viewed as uh, non-disabled people, viewing people with disability as an inspiration for doing simple, uh, everyday things that everyone else does. Um, I use, I talk about this in my book that I have for writers. I have a chapter on inspiration porn, and I kind of talk about this and say, you wouldn't, you wouldn't go up to a stranger at a bar and be like, "Hey, you're out here. You're good job. Like, here's
Mm,
an inspiration. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're here with
yeah.
everyone else and
I can't believe
drinking
you're in
and stuff."
the market. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, are we not supposed to have lives and
Yeah.
do things that everyone else is doing? So,
Yeah.
um, it's just really that it really puts the expectation that there's not much that people with disabilities can do. And
Yeah.
so if they're doing anything at all, it's like, wow, let's give them a gold star
Yeah.
trophy.
And I think as well, like if you yeah, like if you to take that out of context, and if you were to do that to a person without a disability and be like, "Good on you, you bought apples at the supermarket, so good," like someone would be like, "What are you talking about? Like, what is that?" And I think that's like how you should approach it. If it sounds weird to do to someone else, maybe don't do it to a disabled person.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
um, yeah. And that reminds me of something I was thinking about earlier, and then I forgot. You know, and now it came back up again. But the whole thing about if it's weird to do to someone else, you probably shouldn't do it with the disabled person as well. And I kind of wanted to ask, in your interactions, have you had people who just want to come up and pray for you? They just come up to you and be like, "Oh, can I pray for you?" You know, that kind of.
Yeah, I definitely have had those kind of experiences. Definitely just that automatic perception, and I'm sure that people are well intentioned. Like I'm sure that they mean the well, like they mean well, but there's always these really well intentioned assumptions that yeah, like life must be terrible. Let me pray for you. Let me try and heal you. Let me make it better. And it's like, well, what are you trying to make better? Like I'm just living here. I'm not doing anything. Um, I think I actually have a. I'm just reminded I have an article on my blog that I talk about like an experience that I had with someone who just just had to like we're having this conversation, never met them before, and they just assumed that my life must be really bad, and they asked me like, "Are there any things that you don't that you're upset that you can't do?" Like just out of nowhere, like we're complete strangers, and they just felt like that it was okay just to ask you a question like that. And I think that's such an odd question to ask someone. Hey, is there anything that forget all the good stuff that you've got in your life? Is there anything just really bad that you don't like that we can just talk about for a while? So if we just bring up all the bad stuff, and it's such a strange thing to have to do, to focus on negatives and and to have to frame disability in such a negative way. And I think very much the praying for you thing, I think that's very similar. Like they just want to, they have a perception that life must be bad, so they need to verify it by going up to you and yeah, praying for you and making it better. And it's like, I didn't ask you to do that. I'm
Yeah,
fine. I'm very happy. Thank you.
yeah. And like you said, it makes an assumption about that person's life. You don't know what their life is like. Someone with a disability could be doing much better than someone who doesn't, but we don't know people's lives behind the doors, so
No.
you can't make assumptions.
Yeah, and life fluctuates. Like it is a normal part of life that sometimes people will be having a really great time of things, and sometimes maybe they're not having such a great time. And life does fluctuate, and it fluctuates in the same way for disabled people, in the same way as non-disabled people. So I mean, making that assumption from the outset is just strange, and maybe don't do that.
Yeah. um so that actually goes into my next question, which is what do you think are some misconceptions that people have had about you?
It's interesting. So I think one that I often think about is, I am in a wheelchair, and I am, even if I were to be standing, I am a pretty small person. Like I'm only about 5 foot. So I'm not super tall or anything. And I think one misconception that I often have, and so with SMA, like one of the primary symptoms is just kind of that, like fine finger tremors, which you might be familiar with, just like those fine motor tremors. And I think sometimes if I'm having a particular bad day, people can see the motor tremor, like the fine tremors when I'm doing things. And over the years, I've always had people coming up and assuming that I'm really cold, or I'm, oh, she's so cold, she's so little, or like, that I'm frightened of them if I'm having fine motor tremors. And I've often thought about, if that sort of persona of being small and the fine motor tremors and everything contributes to a misconception that I'm somehow not, that I'm not like strong-willed, because I actually think that I probably am a lot more strong-willed than what people expect. I think that, there is probably this misconception that, I'm not going to stand up for myself if something happens. And it's like, yeah, I do let things go, but that's probably because I'm nice. But
Mm-hmm.
like, there are always points where I'm like, no, that's enough. And I think that usually does shock people when I'm like, no. Um, and yeah, I think that that's definitely one misconception that I think comes up quite a bit. Yeah.
I think I'm similar as well in that sense of like, especially for me, I've always been told I have such a soft voice, a quiet voice, and always getting asked to speak up louder. And
Mhm.
so I think that's also a misconception for me that, I'm kind of uh, timid or won't speak up or say something, but it's like, no, it depends on the situation. I am very gracious towards people and I'll let some things go, but push the right buttons and you're gonna get told off.
Yeah, and I do sometimes wonder if that because I don't think it's an isolated experience, that being sort of, especially maybe for women, like disabled women, to be considered timid. And I do sometimes wonder if that's, part of that sort of perception about disability. That there is, oh, little and timid, and no, I don't know, like, but it's not actually the reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Kim here says that so many seem to assume the disabled community are religious. That's
Yeah.
interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think that, there is this, yeah, I think Kim's right, and she's saying that, like, oh, they're saying that, that, like, yeah, that you would assume that a disabled person is going to be, like, involved in church, or wanting to be prayed for, or wanting to be healed, or, and there's just this assumption that that's what you're going to want to do. And I'm sure that there's just as many disabled people who are involved in organized religion, and just as many who aren't. And I think, yeah, it's those assumptions, those like limiting experiences of people with disability to, kind of fit that mold of what they think should be happening.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a
Well,
good point.
that is a really good point. And I will definitely say I am not religious. I'm an atheist. And so it's like, no, I was religious at one point, but
Kind of moved away from it.
moved
Yeah,
away from that.
it's fair enough,
So,
and it's normal part of life. People change opinions and change philosophies on life all the time, and yeah, you can't just assume all that sort of thing. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so going into this next topic is just a little bit about relationships.
Hmm.
So, in general, how has uh, dating and relationships been like for you?
I mean, I think that in all spheres of life, there is always these. perceptions of disability that come up. And I think dating has been no different, because you will find people that, you know, don't really get disability, and they've never met anyone with a disability. They don't know how to handle it. They know how to handle it. I say that in quotations, because it's like, oh wow, so different. But like, I think that definitely, I have, in my dating experiences, I've come across people that just don't really know what to do, and maybe don't want to be dating a person with disability, just because like they just don't know. But I think for me, I've always just looked for shared experiences with people. I've never really I think I've just deliberately chosen not to involve myself too much with people that don't really want to be around me. And as far as I'm concerned, they're kind of missing out, and that's fine. And I just, I've always just looked for like those shared common experiences with the people that I date, and not really, I just try not to occupy myself too much with taking dating on in terms of educating other people. Like, I don't really have time for that. So um I just don't really, if someone has never met a disabled person, they have like, a whole book's worth of questions, and they feel like I need to be the answer for every single thing. I'm like, well, I don't know that I really have that kind of time. Like, maybe you can watch some YouTube, and maybe you can read some books, and you can ask me some normal questions,
Yeah,
of what I like.
yeah, yeah. I think that's actually a great way to just approach it. It's just, what are our common interests?
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to start. Um, the other thing I'll say as well, as to this topic for any writers out there writing disabled characters, keep in mind that, you know, when it comes to disability, you can have a range of sexual orientations and
Yeah.
gender identities as well. And so I think that might be another kind of misconception
Oh,
when it comes to disability. Is like,
yeah.
if people do know that they date we date, it's like, oh, but they're cisgender, straight, hetero. It's like,
Yeah.
not everyone. There's
No,
plenty of LGBTQ plus
100%.
individuals with disabilities.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that that's actually a huge thing within the disabled community, is that quite often that disabled identity gets so overpowered that disabled people don't get as much space to explore, and to even sort of affirm those other parts of their identity. And I think that's really important for writers to remember, that there's just as many disabled people that are in the LGBTQ community, just as many who, who have all of those kind of varied experiences. And yeah, you don't just have to write a heterosexual cisgender disabled romance.
Yeah. So, um, so the next question, keeping on the topic of writing disabled characters, what is it that you really want writers to know when writing a disabled characters? What do they need to keep in mind, and what stereotypes do they need to just get rid of?
Yeah. So I think there's a few different things that I think about this question. I mean, I think the first thing is like, when you're writing a disability, like, don't just, a disabled person's life is a myriad of different experiences, and to remember that when you're writing a character, that like, yes, they have a disability, and yes, there are going to be things that you're going to have to think about, but at the same time, they are still an individual in their own right, and they probably have a lot of other interests, and they have things that make them tick. And don't just reduce that character into becoming, oh, that's my disabled one, and that's so I'm just going to tick that box. Like, make them real. Like, they have real experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just perhaps also giving them that perception of, just also don't impose stereotypes on them. Like, think deeply about like what kind of character are you making and why do you have to write that character, and try to see things from their own perspective. Like go to the communities of go into those communities and sort of get to know the people in those communities to kind of understand, am I imposing views on them, or is that how that character would actually think?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. And that's something I always say as well and mention is just, you know, make sure your characters are well rounded and,
Mm.
they're not just one thing or one identity there
Mm.
to tick off a box.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Um, yeah, I was, in preparation for this live stream, I was thinking about some of the disabled characters that I've read over the years. Because when I was young, I didn't really come across many of this, many characters with disabilities. So whenever I did read one, I was like, oh, I really remember that one. And it wasn't till later as an adult that I've kind of just been looking back over them. And like, I think one of the first disabled characters that I read was in a book called Jodie's Journey by Colin Teely. I don't know if you've heard of it, but Colin Teely is a well-known Australian writer. But the character Jodie has a rheumatoid arthritis, and she's involved. There was a very large fire in the 80s in Australia called, and it was known as Ash Wednesday. And basically Jodie is living out in the Australian sort of outback in the hills, and she's got rheumatoid arthritis. She used to be a horse jumper, so already you can see she's got like quite a myriad life, even though she's got this disability. Then the fire comes, and she needs to rescue one of her horses. Her parents are away. She's just a teenager, and she kind of needs to escape the fire with this horse while she's got her disability to kind of going on as well, which makes things difficult. And like that was the first disabled character that I'd ever read. Um, and I found her to be so interesting. Even though Colin Tilley was not a disabled person, I understand that he wrote that book because he had a young reader write to him and say, "Oh, I've never read a disabled character. Could you write one, please?" And so he wrote Jodie's Journey because of that. But I believe he did have arthritis, so he could sort of relate a little bit. But so yeah, he did have that kind of that lived experience to kind of draw upon in sort of writing Jodie. But yeah, I think she was a character that I really held on to because I'd never met. When I was reading it in school, I was like, oh, she uses a wheelchair. I do too. Oh, she gets me. Like, and it was huge for me as a young kid to kind of come across a character in a wheelchair who was losing an ability to walk at the same time that I was. And that was really huge. And I wish that there'd been more of that when I was younger. But as I said, Colin Teely is a well-known Australian author, and I've come across other people my age with a disability who've read Jodie's Journey, and that's always like the quintessential book for like or that I've come across. If you're a reader and you have a disability, you all know Jodie's Journey because it's like that was the book like for a disabled kid to be reading. I've noticed more and more though as time goes on that there have been more and more books with disabled characters, and I'm kind of really hopeful for being able to see more of that as time goes on, especially authors drawing upon their lived experiences to write a disabled character. I think that's really important too.
mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, I mean, you led perfectly into what the next
Oh,
question was. Um,
okay.
so, are there? I know you talked about uh, Jodie
Jodie's
Jodie's
Journey.
Journey as one of the books that
Mm.
you know had a really big influence on you
Yeah.
as a disabled kid. Are there any other books or characters that you've read that you think has done a really good job with
Yeah.
the
So
characters?
yeah. So I mean, I think a recent one that I read is Please Don't Hug Me by Kay Kerr. She's an Australian writer who has autism. And Please Don't Hug Me is about a teenager with autism, sort of writing some journal entries and diary entries and letters to her brother who has gone away. And it's just kind of so it's kind of a bit of a series of letters that the main character is writing, and they've got autism and they're kind of navigating that as a young person. What I really liked about that one is, one, I think, it's great that um, you know Keiko was able to use lived experience, which I think is important. Like, I don't think, I think if you're going to write a disabled character, I think starting at lived experience, even if you don't have the exact lived experience, but maybe going to others to kind of get some inspiration and some ideas about how to write that person is really important. But if you can't, then I think that you should start with your own experiences, to look to, what characters with disability can I write authentically. So yeah, I think, yeah, Please Don't Hug Me is a recent one that I thought was really good. As a sort of a teenager, I read Flame of Seven Waters by Juliet Marillier, and that's a fantasy Celtic mythology type one. But the main character was in a fire and has is an amputee, so they've got they don't have all of their fingers, and they have trouble lifting things and holding things, and they've got some chronic pain and stuff. And I found that character. I remember, I've always been a bit of a nerd, so I remember like reading the author had actually put a call out. Juliet Marillier is not someone who is an amputee, so I remember that she put a call out to her readers just for some lived experience, or some, I just remember the post was a bit like, hey, I'm writing this character, like this is the sort of stuff that they're going through. Is there anyone, do I know anyone that might be able to give me some insights into what life like that would be like, and to make sure that I've got it right. And I remember that. So like when I saw the book came out, I went and read it. And what I really liked about it was that it did feel authentic. And that character wasn't reduced just to their disability, but they were kind of an active participant in the story. And it wasn't just, this is that thing that happened and that's all we're going to talk about for 300 pages. It was like, Maeve, who's the main character, is like, they're an amputee, they've have trouble holding things or grabbing things, but like, let's think about ways that Maeve would have lived, and what Maeve would have done if she were a real person. So yeah, I think definitely going to the audience, if you don't have that lived experience, but going to an audience, or asking people questions, I think can be a really good thing to do. And I think in terms of what could be done better, I think if you're, just be careful not to impose views about disability onto your characters. Like, go to lived experience first. I think that's the basic message.
Yeah. And also definitely, if you don't have much lived experience, get sensitivity readers as well.
Yes.
I think that's always going to be a really big one.
Yes.
And then also wanted to point out as well that, the last book that you talked about, you said that was a fantasy one,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And that's something else that I kind of want to point out to writers as well, is, you can have disabled characters in a variety of genres. You can have them in fantasy books and sci-fi books and, all sorts of different genres. It doesn't have to be, a realistic contemporary, this is what it's like to live with a disability type of book. You can have a disabled character. One book that I really like that has a disabled character is the Cursebreaker series. The first book is called A Curse So Dark and Lonely, and it's a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. And our main character, Harper, who's supposed to be Belle in this retelling, but Harper has cerebral palsy. And
awesome.
yeah, I think the author did a really great job with her character, and how showing kind of how her disability influences her life and her day-to-day interactions, but it doesn't it's not the center of the story. um,
Mm,
and so, you know, just keep that in mind. You can have disabled characters in all types of different
yeah.
genres and stories.
Yeah. It it is very much like I will actually keep an eye out to look for that book because I think I've heard of it, but I didn't realize there was a disabled character in it. So I think I'd like to read it now. But
Yeah.
I was gonna say that yeah, like you just got to keep that diversity in mind. Like don't reduce their experiences to yeah, like I can only write a disabled character in a contemporary, you know, like it can be any genre that you want. You know, if you make that person real.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the most important part, is to make them feel like a real character, like any of your other characters. So,
Yeah, definitely.
um, and Kim said, the music of bees by Ellen Garvin covers disability too.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'm
Cool.
gonna keep. That's good. I've been trying to make it an effort to read more books with characters with disabilities. So I think I might add that to my list of things. But um, yeah, I definitely think I definitely see a lot more books than what I used to with disabled characters in them. So I'm hoping that as time goes on, that it'll just become a little bit. You know, writers will start to get it right, and hopefully with resources such as this, it'll help as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I'm gonna go ahead and let you know, if anyone watching the live right now has any questions they want to pop in the chat box about anything we've discussed tonight, on disability, writing disabled characters. If anyone has any questions they'd like to pop in the chat box, go ahead and drop it down below, and we'll discuss it. And I think I just had one last question for you tonight,
Yeah.
and then we'll see if anyone popped anything in the chat box. But so my last question for tonight was your thoughts on writers who do not have disabilities writing stories about characters with disabilities.
I mean, I I think that there are obviously like, you know, there are those two camps on it. I know that there is a big push for own voices and things like that in literature, but and I definitely think that that has value, like, you know, like writers with, you know, own lived experience writing other characters. That has real power, but I also think too that um I think if a writer is genuinely wanting to write a character with disability, I don't think they should shy away from that. I think that if a writer definitely knows that they want to have a character with disability in their book, I would always encourage them to try that. Personally, I think that that's important because you know we advocate for more representation at every turn,
Mhm.
and I think that it's only right to encourage representation when there is genuine interest in doing that. I
Mhm.
think as long as the writer is committed to trying to get that lived experience to be as authentic and real as possible, then I say go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
and doing the sensitivity reading and doing your research.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, you know. As long as, you know, you make sure you do the appropriate research and, um, you know, you ask questions, get a sensitivity reader. I think that's great, to have more of that representation.
Mhm.
Um, so let's see in here. Um, so when Winterwolf um, popped into the chat. And if you want to tell us your name, that's cool too. If not, that's fine. Um, but Winterwolf said, A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. Martin has several characters who have disabilities they are either born with or gain at different points in their lives. Um, if you read it, did George R. Martin do well?
So, I haven't actually read A Song of Ice and Fire, but I have watched the TV series. So I mean, I can only answer it from the perspective of the TV series, but I thought that they actually did really well, and I mean, I think you know, Tyrion Lannister was, I mean, I think he was an absolutely brilliant character. He was you know, powerful in his own right. He had, you know, he did have a disability, but like he had so much other stuff going on as well, and he was a real and authentic character, and I thought it was brilliant. And like I've had get the Game of Thrones books on my to read list for quite some time. I think as all readers can probably relate, they're like it you always have like a never ending list of books that need to be done. But I really wanted to read A Song of Ice and Fire just for the disabled characters, because I thought George R. R. Martin yeah, did a really good job from what I'd seen in the TV series. So yeah,
Yeah.
definitely very well done.
With
There's
Song of
also
Ice and
Brandon
Fire.
Stark as well. Sorry, go. I just saying there's also
No, I
Brandon
didn't.
Stark. Yeah,
There's also what you
Brandon
cut out.
Stark.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Sorry.
Stop.
Yeah, there was also Brandon Stark was the other character that I could think of here. I think he acquired his disability during the series, and I think that
Yeah.
was also good as well.
Yeah. Um, I was just gonna say, I I've only seen, I think, the first season of, yeah, for no, maybe the first two seasons of Game of Thrones, the show, and then I've read the first two books, and it's a series that's on my list to finish at some point. I debate whether or not I want to finish the series, because at this point I'm like, George, what are you doing? You have 5 books out. No one knows when the next book is supposed to come out.
Yeah.
So it's like, are you gonna finish the story or not? And if you're not, do I really want to continue with the series?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm at with the series. But I have read the first two books. It's been a while, but from what I can think of, I remember between the books and the show, um, I do think all of his characters were uh, were pretty well-rounded characters. I don't think I can't remember any character being like, oh, this is just the disabled character, or
Yeah.
they're just ticking off a box or something like that. I actually really like Tyrion's character.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how he is throughout the rest of the series, but from what I've seen in the first two books and the first one or two seasons of the show, I'm like, I like his character.
Yeah. I think he's definitely well-rounded, and I think too, like just from what I've seen in the TV show, and I would be interested to see how that's portrayed in the books as well, is like I see a lot in the TV show where he you know, the family is imposing their perceptions of disability onto him, like, or other people are always like, you know, they have names for him, like they have, you know, derogatory names, or they you know, they kind of make assumptions about what he can and can't do. And you know, he really just like steers his course and you know, takes it by the horns, and is like, yep, this is what I'm going to do, and like, you're not expecting it, but here's what's going to happen. Like and I think that's what's really powerful about him, is just that you know, there's that awareness that there is that perception, and Tyrion is all in the middle of it. And no one's, you know, I think that's the element of good writing a disabled character, is that you know, there's that awareness that that perception is happening, but Tyrion is also in the driver's seat as an individual in his own right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that was really great about this character. And then I remember now, Brandon is
Yeah.
Brandon Stark, right?
Brandon Stark was one of the young Stark boys. Yeah,
Yeah,
the son.
that he got pushed out of the tower
Mm.
and became paralyzed, disabled. Um, and I don't know. I might be mixing thoughts from the show with the books. They kind of blend in right in my head right now. But with his character, you know, from what I remember, we started to see a little bit of that frustration on his part of,
Mm.
you know, not being able to do certain things and having this disability now and not being able to do some things. Um,
Mm.
and then, you know, finding other ways to actually do it. Like, I think the riding the horse, I think,
Mm.
one thing they had to figure out how to help him to do that now since his disability. And, you know, I think that was actually done really well because, you know, I think, I mean, I can't speak for someone who uh, obtains a disability after not having one, after living
Mm.
life without one, and then suddenly becoming disabled. Um, I can't speak to that, but I can imagine the frustration and the
Mm.
sadness that would come along with that.
Yeah.
And so, and in a sense, I can kind of imagine a little bit because, you know, with SMA, we do lose certain abilities over time. You were talking about at the beginning of the interview how you stopped walking around 8 or 9, and then um, couldn't stand on your own or bear weight at like 18, 19.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think, you know, in that sense, we kind of can understand a little bit of what that's like for someone without a disability to um, suddenly gain a disability and the emotions that come with that.
Mm. Yeah. I definitely think that there was that aspect to yeah, Brand's character. And yeah, I do think that, yeah, you can relate to it. You can understand that that would be a very real thing that would be happening if you had a very sudden life change. That it would be like a bit of a an initial struggle to kind of be like, wow, okay, this is the new reality. How do I navigate this? Yeah, so I think it's definitely like two very distinct experiences of disability, even in the same book, which I think is really great too.
Yeah. So we have a couple more comments coming in, and this person. So if you guys want to pop your names in the chat, is it on Henri? I'm sorry if I said that wrong. Um, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But he says they say my question was going to be exactly this last question. I don't have any disabilities, and I'm often of unintentional doom. I think that's often think or
Unintentionally doing something wrong.
unintentionally doing something wrong. This life was very helpful.
Mm.
Well, thanks. I'm so glad. Um, often scared. Okay, yeah.
Yep.
Often scared of doing something unintentionally doing something wrong. Okay, so I am
Yeah.
glad that this life could help with that. That's
Mm.
exactly why I started doing this series on my channel. Is to help writers to write characters that are different than them and
Yeah.
to have more representation overall. So,
Yeah. Great.
um, and then when Two Wolf said, during my last reread, I really noticed how many characters in that series have a disability. Tyrion Bran Aemon
Mm-hmm.
is blind.
Yeah, I forgot about him.
Holder, mental illness. I forgot about that one.
Mm,
Um, Men Who Lost Hands, and more in the companion books.
it's fascinating. I honestly, I think that's entirely right. Oh, let you read that first.
Um, it just says all of them are treated as capable while their disabilities aren't brushed aside or ignored. Having Tyrion actually ride in a couple battles, and Bran still wants to be a knight. Aemon is respected. Yeah.
Yeah. I 100% agree. I'm actually going to make that one of my jobs now to read A Song of Ice and Fire, just to study that a little bit, because I think I actually forgot how many there were until I just read that comment. Like, it's actually
Yeah.
very, very true.
Yeah.
And I think that that's probably, yeah, some of like, at least when I was watching the TV series, that was what some of the power that I thought was in it, was that there were, yeah, disabled characters doing real stuff, not
Yeah.
just, yeah. Yeah, that's quite fascinating to think about. That's yeah, awesome. That's a really good point.
Now that I think about it, I'm like, this is probably why George R. Martin is taking forever and a day to release each new book, because, he's got a lot of great characters in his stories, and I think he does a good job at at the characters that he has, making them authentic and well rounded and feel like real people. And his books are pretty dang big and thick. So I'm
Mm,
sure he's got a lot
yeah.
of research he's got to do, a lot of work
Yeah.
to do.
And
So,
and I think too, it's like one thing that I've always thought about A Song of Ice and Fire is that he does have a very strong element of realism in his books, that probably doesn't happen as much. I don't see as much of another fantasy, for better or worse. Like, and what I mean by that too is it's not just like that realism of like someone makes a decision and so they die, and when normally the hero wouldn't die. It's not just that. It's also just like, if people are in battle or if people are in an accident, they probably are going to have a life-sustaining injury. That's just a normal part of life, and something that I don't actually see a lot of in other books is like the hero is often fine. It's very rare that the hero in other books is, or the heroes, they have a big injury, they recovered in a few months, they're okay now. But like in George, in A Song of Ice and Fire, like, it's like there are very real ramifications, as you would have in real life. If you fell out of a window, you probably will have a like a like, you will have a disability from that, probably. If you might recover or you might not. And I think that realism is kind of, you know a really good thing to think about. Making it as real, as authentic as possible, and disability is a normal part of life experience.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think also going along with that is that, just keeping in mind, I don't think a lot of times uh, the writers really think about not just the cost or ramifications of um, a character being in battle and stuff physically, but there's also the mental side of it as well that I don't think a lot of times.
Mm.
I feel like we uh, writers can easily forget about that,
Yeah.
and it's like, yeah, they just went into battle and fought the villain and saved the day and saved the
Yeah.
world and won and whatever. And maybe it's a fantasy world, so maybe physically they have all their injuries magically healed or whatever, but there's still that mental component of
Mm.
what this does to a person.
Yeah.
And I've mentioned before where it's like, there's some stories that I read, some characters, I'm like, after all you went through, you should have severe PTSD. Like,
Yeah.
how are you so normal? You cannot be this normal. It's
Yeah,
just
and that's actually, I was actually just about to say, and you actually just got to my point there. Like, I was just thinking of The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, and like Katniss Everdeen's character arc, across the three books. And like, after she goes through the Hunger Games and the things that she has to go through, in terms of war and stuff, she does have PTSD, and she's not ever quite going to be the same. And I remember really respecting that when I read them, just being like, yeah, because that's the reality of violence and war, is that you might end up with some PTSD if you've been through some really traumatic experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, yeah, I thought that I really respected that was a real thing for Katniss.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's something I say as well in my um I have an online course for writers on how to write diverse characters, and that's one of the things I have talked about in one of my lessons. I'm kind of like, I say it jokingly, but also not so jokingly. I'm like, you need to learn, you basically need to become a psychologist if you're a writer, because you've got to know how the stuff that is um, taking place, how it's going to affect your characters, uh, you know, mentally, emotionally, um, and how they're going to react to that.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, if anyone else has any last minute questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box. But we will, start wrapping this up. And I want to just say thank you to everyone who was here in the live, chatting with us and asking questions. And thank you to Chantel for being here my evening, but your morning. So being here today to talk about disability and writing disabled characters. So thank you for taking the time to come and do that.
Yeah, thank you for having me on here, and yeah, thank you to everyone who's been watching and asking questions, and yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So for anyone who is watching, who's interested, someone, oh, thanks for, no problem. I love doing this series, so it's something I definitely want to continue on a monthly basis. Um, but for anyone who is watching this live, I do have a playlist of the other interviews that I've done so far. I've done 3 interviews so far in the series, so I have a playlist that's linked in the description box below if you guys want to check that out. And then also, if anyone here is writing a character with a disability and their story, I actually have a new book that just came out in July, and I'm going to pull it up on the screen right now. It's called A Writer's Guide to Creating Diverse Characters, Disability. Um, so if you're looking to learn more and get more information about writing disabled characters, you can check out my ebook. The link is in the description below as well. So I think that's pretty much it that I have. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
And I guess I will see everyone next month with another interview. Bye.
See ya.